before the demo so that we can see what's going on, but typically we're going to have the guard on while we're using the table saw, but it's pretty difficult to see. When we talk about table saws, one of the things I like to start talking about is the cost of this equipment. So we at school, we have commercial quality stuff. You will see this same stuff if you walk into a manufacturing plant or a cabinet shop somewhere. It's the same things that we have in class. So this setup right here with the fence, the guard, all that stuff is probably about $5,000. That's a nice table saw. You can get the same type of table saw if you go to Home Depot for $150. It's going to work and function the same. The difference is the weight of this, because the heavier the table saw, the more stable it is, the easier you can cut a bigger piece of wood, and then the quality of the fence. At my shop, I have a big table saw like this that I use. Mine was not $5,000, but I also have a smaller one that I bring to job sites when I do cabinet installs. So the smaller one I think I spent $200 on, and the bigger one I think I spent $1,500 on. And it works the same as this, but it does not have the saw stop feature on it. So we're paying a substantial amount to have that saw stop feature, but even if that adds $1,000 or $2,000 to the cost of the saw, it's worth it to save somebody's fingers, especially with all the medical bills and things like that. So this is an expensive saw, but the same rules apply to a lesser expensive saw. These blanks in here, I'd like you to fill out as we're going through. I'll try to hit all of them. If I skip one, let me know. So we'll start with number 1, and these are going to tell the story of how we use the table saw. So the first one, it's a big piece of wood. If I want to cut this piece of wood, the blade of the table saw should be no more than 3/4 of an inch above the material that we're cutting. Three-fourths of an inch is about the height of the teeth on the table saw. So all saw blades are going to have teeth on them. And the space from the top of the tooth to the bottom of this gusset right here, this gap, is usually about 3/4 of an inch. So you can lay your board up, check that, and make sure that your height is right at about 3/4 of an inch. If you need to adjust it, let's say I'm cutting something thicker or thinner, right in front of your waist is a wheel that I can turn up to the right to make it go up, or down to the left to make it go down. This is one of those measurements that I am not going to get a tape measure out and double check that you're right on the money with it. It's a rule of thumb. So you can quickly look through the clear guard and say, okay, that's going to cut all the way through my bullet, all the way through my board, or I need to adjust something. So please don't get real picky about it, but we need to make sure that it's about at the right height. Number 2 and 3 kind of go together. But number 2 says the smallest board that can be cut without using a push stick is 3 inches wide. 3 inches. That's the rule for just about every machine in here. We want to keep our hands at least 3 inches away from the blade. So that means I can set the fence. So this piece that I'm moving right now, this is called the fence. And on here is a tape measure that's been stuck down. So I can look at my fence, and there's a red indicator line. I could put that on any one of these measurements, and right now it's at 4 inches. So I know that I am exactly 4 inches from the fence to the blade. Now, I try to have all these things be really accurate, so what you don't have to do, and what I see some people do, and maybe this is what you had to do in middle school, is let's say I needed a 4-inch piece of wood out of here. I'll see some people draw a line at 4 inches, then come to the table saw and trying to line it up just right to cut their 4 inches. You don't have to do that. You just set the fence at 4 inches, and it's going to cut at 4 inches. You don't have to double check it. It's going to be right on the money for you. Unless somebody's dropped it, kicked it, done something crazy to it. Sometimes crazy things happen in the school. Number 3, the shortest board that can be cut on the table saw is 10 inches. 10 inches. When we're talking about lumber, we are thinking of a width by the length. So whenever I call out dimensions, let's say I need a board at 1 by 10. That means it's going to be 1 inch wide by 10 inches long. It's always width that's called out before length. So number 4, ripping wood is cutting with the grain. Is that the phrase? I updated it. I don't have the updated one, but does that make sense with what you got for number 4? Ripping wood is cutting with the grain of the wood. So if you look at that picture shows a table saw cutting with the grain. Now when we say grain, the grain of the wood is the lines that we see in the wood. Sometimes they're not perfectly straight. Now this is pretty faint. This is a piece of poplar, so you can't see them very well. But generally speaking, these lines are going up and down. So if I'm cutting with those lines, I'm ripping the board and I'm making it narrower. And number 5 says, cross-cutting is cutting across the grain of the wood. Just like that little image there. That saw blade is cutting across the grain of the wood. When we cross-cut something, we are cutting across the grain. So the table saw is about 90% ripping. About 90 to 95% of what we use the table saw for is to make boards narrower. What would be a saw that we would use to cross-cut this piece of wood? Say that again? You can do it by hand. We got a couple machines too that can do it. Yeah.
Miter saw?
The miter saw, yeah. Some of you can't see, but it's the orange or yellow saw right around the corner there. Or we've also got a big panel saw in the back that can cross-cut it. Cutting like this is super dangerous. If you try to make a cut like this, especially you fellas, that board is going to get kicked back and hit you in a place that you'd probably not rather have something hit you at a high rate of speed. It would hurt everybody. So be careful of that. We'll talk a little bit more about kickbacks in a second. Number 6, always stand to the left side of the material being cut. It is the safest place to stand in the event of a kickback. We're actually going to show you a video of what a kickback looks like at the end of this. But a kickback, essentially, the board gets thrown straight back. So if you're standing off to the left-hand side, hopefully it either misses you and hits the poor sucker that's standing back there, or it just glances off of you. I've had 3 kickbacks in my life, and every one of them has been a very painful experience. The first one hit me. It was a board that was about this size, but it was a 1/4 inch thick, and it hit me right in the thigh. And it left a bruise about the size of a football for a couple weeks on my thigh, and it really did not start feeling good until 3 or 4 weeks after that. Be careful with them. The other one hit me in the belly. I got Dunlop disease. You guys know what Dunlop disease is? My belly Dunlopped over my belt. And so I've got a little bit extra insulation there. So I've been hitting the belly the other 2, and that's been helpful that I like to eat, so it didn't hurt quite so bad. But it still didn't feel that great. Number 7, the right thumb should always be tucked in near the palm of the hand when ripping wood. If I'm going to rip this piece of wood, I don't want my thumb sticking out like this. Your right hand is going to do most of the work on the table saw. I'm sorry, left-handed people, it's going to feel awkward and uncomfortable, but you're going to have to use your right hand because we can't be reaching across the board, across the blade to cut your board. It's set up really well for righties to do this, and I am sorry. But if you're left-handed, your parents got it just cut on you because you got built backwards. So you'll just have to learn to deal with it like the rest of us. So your right thumb needs to point straight down. Okay, we don't want the thumb sticking out. We want it straight down so that it's hooked behind our board. I'll show you in a minute how to make the whole cut, but when we got the board all the way on the table, we need to have the thumb behind it. We don't want to have it out like this because things that stick out tend to get cut off, and we don't want that to happen. Number 8, this is the most common time when people could get hurt or touch a moving blade. Never remove scraps of wood from near the blade when the blade is moving. I redid these safety rules this morning. I thought I fixed all the typos, but I just found one. I don't even have a pen to mark it. Oh well. So let's just say I cut this piece of wood, and there's a scrap sitting there. Now we've got the blade guard on, but we can see through the blade guard because it's clear. We want to let the blade come to a complete stop before I reach in here and grab a piece of wood. Most of the time, and one of the 2 times that the saw stop has gone off, is this exact thing happened. The blade was spinning pretty slow, but if the blade is spinning at all, that saw stop is going to activate. So the student reached in to grab the board, and touched the blade, and that's what set the saw stop off. Again, it's an expensive thing every time it goes off, especially if you could just wait 1 more second, and we could avoid that problem from happening. So let the blade stop, and then take your scrap piece out. Don't try to do it while the blade is still spinning. Number 9, never use the miter gauge and fence at the same time. So the miter gauge lives over here, And like we talked about, the table saw can do a lot of different things. We talked about the miter saw probably being the best tool to cut miters, but every once in a while we'll run into a situation, and it's usually trying to fix a mistake that somebody's made, where we'll need to use the table saw to cut a miter. And that's okay. I can take this, hold it here, make my cut, and I'm just fine. It cuts decently. Now, the miter saw still cuts, I believe, a straighter angle. At least it's easier to get a perfect 90 out of the miter saw than the table saw. But what we can't use is the miter gauge and the fence at the same time. When we use them at the same time, what happens is I make my cut, but then I've got this piece of wood stuck right here. And that little piece of wood, all it takes is one little corner of the blade to hit that piece of wood, and it's going flying. So we never use the miter gauge and fence at the same time. So the fence has to be well away when we're going to make the cut. Number 10 is also a miter gauge question. When using the miter gauge, never return the board past the blade after the cut is made. That all rhymes. So let's say I make the... Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going too fast. That's number 10. When using the miter gauge, never return the board past the blade after the cut is made. Let's say I just made this cut. I'm going to get my board out of there. I am not going to make the cut and then pull it back, because all again it takes is one tooth to grab the board and shoot it back at us, and we don't want that to happen. If you are going to use the miter gauge on the table saw, I ask that you come get me. I would love to be with you as we go through that, because I don't want you to do something that's going to hurt yourself, and I want to make sure it works out well for you. This is something that we almost never use, but every once in a while it comes in really handy. Then number 11, never use the table saw without the guard. You don't have to fill anything in there. Ask me if you feel like it should be moved. There's no reason that we have to move the guard, but if there's something that you're thinking, some way that would make it easier, I'm open to the idea, but again, I want to be right here with you when it does happen to talk through whatever it is that you need to do on the table saw. All right, now we're moving more into how the table saw works. We have a 10-inch table saw, which is by far the most common size of table saw. They do make bigger ones, and they probably make smaller ones, but I'm not really aware of them. This is a 10-inch table saw blade. Usually, the more teeth the blade has, the finer the material that you're cutting. So the more fragile the material, I should say, that you're cutting. We have a pretty general purpose 40-tooth blade in here right now. That's good for cross-cutting, that's good for ripping, both plywood and solid wood. It's a really high-quality blade that we have in there. The blade, if we could all fly and look down in here, I'm going to take this piece off. It's called the throat plate. And when we look down inside of here, what you're going to see is there's a big bolt sticking out, and the blade goes on top of that bolt. And then that bolt has a washer that goes here, and then there's a nut that goes on here to hold the blade to the shaft of the table saw. Now that gets down there pretty tight, and then that spins. So to take this off, to take the blade off, you're going to use the wrenches. One wrench holds the shaft in place, one wrench goes on the nut, and that's how we take off the table saw blade. You shouldn't ever have to do that, especially with this table saw. This one should always be set up. When we talk about the dado cutting table saw, and show you the setup of that one in a couple days, I'll show you how to take the blade on and off. One question I want to ask you is, why do you think that this bolt, or this nut that holds the blade on, why do you think it has left-handed threads? Yes. So, what he's saying there is that this spins towards me, and if we had a traditional righty-tighty, lefty-loosey threads, what would happen is that nut would come loose every time this turns on. Because this goes from 0 to 4,000 RPMs almost instantly. That's a lot of torque on that nut, and it would eventually loosen it, and you don't want to be the poor sucker standing here when the blade comes flying off at you. So whoever invented the table saw decided that, hey, we should put backwards threads. So now, instead of it loosening every time it gets turned on, it actually tightens. So the bolt is a little bit harder to take off than it is to put on, because it's been however many cycles turned on and off. So it really puts a lot of stress on there. It's not really hard to get off, but you'll notice it is significantly harder to take off. Number 14, the riving knife. And the riving knife is actually called a splitter. Riving knife is the technical term for it. Everybody that I've ever talked to calls it a splitter. So that's why it says riving knife